Hey, stream is live. Tell your friends. Tell all your friends the stream is live.
It's still a production process.
How are you doing? Yeah? Production line is like busy right now. Every time I open the paper, it's like a new event.
I know, yeah, that was our last big one.
December was
Until
first night or something like that. What are you doing? What's happening?
No. Yeah, so I usually be
So I was part of one of the other projects that was in this round. So I was Oh, I'm in Letsinger, so I work in architecture. No, that was an AC building. I've been in it many times.
okay, yeah. So we purposely wanted
So it's kind of like an hour distance of trick with some of the magnets that feel a little short, so they still are
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I think it is its last, but its last it might have a duration.
I live in kind of in the southwest side. So I live in the center. Yeah, that's also
Hey Jeff, I know you have hot sauce.
Yeah, yeah. Wish you were here.
When I was looking on on the way, like it's near the Orcas coming in there, but the entire
Oh, yeah.
right, and the cave was so small. And so like they
We got to.
about it, to be honest. I like Dave's favorite, but that was really
Chat that they're going to communicate on. No, never.
People are really selling.
So, I actually currently don't.
Are we gonna have to do email?
But I'm open. I can.
And that's a lot how I know.
Currently signal. You signal.
We can do signal.
But
Signal's like a better privacy, less function.
Yeah, no, because as far as I know, that's,
I like the better.
I know, that's why people use it. Okay, I'm gonna read the conference. I used to be a signal.
But that being said,
oh, okay, well, that would be.
no,
We can do.
I'm a communication.
Yeah, because, you know, we looked at it, for 2019, Adriana and I were planning on
I just want to.
a session of.
Oh,
If
yeah.
everyone's, if everyone's okay with this,
I'm
maybe
sure.
that's fine.
I know, I'm sure.
Get more excited people
Just
come in.
great conversation to have with Townsend.
So yeah, start in 5, sound good?
Okay.
Cool. Besito.
Or maybe it's just our intimate group.
Yeah, let's open space this thing all the way. The power of 2 feet means the bathroom's over there. I love open space.
I heard a couple of people tonight walk over the top.
We're doing it for,
You can hear them talking.
No, but I did it I did it for like a transition, for peak oil something. What was our group?
Yeah.
That was good.
He's the head of the CIO.
So Chris, there,
We just have to run it.
I 10 minutes ago.
I think we are going to.
See how far.
I've done variations of it in my own presentations. I don't play video open space.
Really happy. We partnered with them for their.
Okay. So are they still, is there any more information?
Yeah, tonight I'm bringing in the slides.
I've been trying to find that post-COVID.
Yeah, right.
I don't have one of those.
Yeah.
No, actually, this
They do the 3 hours.
I've been giving the same talk, which is right, so,
They do
so
3
normally
they'll
I
do,
just, make up different talks.
we welcome our new condo overlords.
Students at the GIS and built the water. the crazy character.
My name is Rose. I work for the Managers Network. So one of the things that we we're the sponsor here as well as the local 2020. So we're really happy that you guys are here. And really glad to be at Fort Worden. So we're really grateful for them and really grateful that you guys came. So I just wanted to actually give a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands we are on are within the traditional indigenous tribal lands of the S'Klallam, Chimacum, and other indigenous peoples. These indigenous peoples are the original stewards of these lands and waters since time immemorial. We strive to create a future where we can deepen our partnerships together and create positive change. We acknowledge our interconnectedness and will continue to work to find ways to honor our interdependence with each other and all life around us to create an inclusive, encouraging community. So tonight, we are lucky enough to have the Regeneration Tour with us, and Joe Brewer is going to give some great information to us. And then we're also going to do, I'm going to share a little bit about the connectivity fair that happened here in April. Many of you were likely there, and those of you who weren't, I think would benefit from seeing at least some of our information. Tell you more about that later. And then I just wanted to say that United Urban Network is bringing in some really interesting things to the corporate offices here, and one of the best things right now is on Sunday we're bringing Tommy Beyond Ananda. It's on Sunday from 2 to 4, and he is funny, he's irreverent, he's comical, so current day, he's very, has high integrity and spiritual, so he's really funny. So you can get tickets from us, there's little handbills that you can take home with you. And then there's other things that we're going to be creating, other events coming up with at the turn of the year about climate kind of issues, conversations, presentations. So we have a second sheet over on the table over there, or we will pass it around if you want to stay up on what we're doing. We're happy to tell you. And then there over on the table there are these sheets that are full of, there are so many organizations in town here that do service work, that do things whether it's environmental focus or for kids or a whole litany of housing and food. So if you're looking for a way to plug in, you probably already do a lot of things like that, but this is a really awesome list to work with. So we have those over there. And there's a donation jar over there that helps put this on. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Joe and enjoy it.
So good evening, everyone. My name's Joe Brewer, and I want to thank especially Rick and Rose and Christy for organizing for us to come tonight. And I'm actually here to talk with you about something that's really, really important. And so, so I want to begin by just saying that we have been on the road now for nearly 3 weeks, having the same conversation in a series of places to try to catalyze the kind of weaving of conversations that we think is necessary for what is happening in the world. And so the key thing for all of this is going to be that this is a conversation that needs to continue. So even though I don't live here, I live in Colombia in South America, although I have lived in Seattle and Eugene, Oregon, and I've been in this region for a big part of my life, I don't live here, which is to say that what I'm going to share with you is more for what I hope you will be carrying forward. And so this is one of those opportunities to have a conversation that we think can ignite a new stage in the development of this idea of Cascadia that has been around for decades. And so what I've been doing when I give this talk is I actually like to start by explaining my title, because this title actually has some very specific elements to it. First of all, you see that it doesn't say, do we regenerate Cascadia? as if it's a question like maybe we should. It's how. And for me, the how is really, really important because we haven't figured out how to regenerate entire bioregions yet. And so we've got to get to this scale. This is pushing the envelope on the regenerative work that is happening in the world, as you'll see in what I'm going to talk about today. I actually think the next horizon of the regenerative movement is regenerating continents. And I see this as a step along the way. And so how do we regenerate Cascadia? We're going to talk about how we actually go about organizing at this scale. The other thing is I want to talk about the word regenerate. Because regenerate or regeneration is currently being greenwashed. Like regenerative agriculture is strongly promoted by the Gates Foundation. I'm sure that's a good idea. And so this word regenerate or regeneration is being greenwashed, just like sustainability has. And we can fully expect this to happen. This is how the propaganda machine works. But luckily, if we know what regeneration is, it doesn't matter if it's greenwashed. Which is to say, what matters is that we know what regeneration is. Because regeneration is the pattern of any living system to recreate the conditions of being alive moment to moment. For example, if you have a blue-tailed lizard and the tail falls off of the lizard, it can grow its tail back, it can regenerate it. A starfish that loses an arm can grow back its arm, it regenerates its arm. Or if you look at my arm, and see this skin, everything you see is dead. This is all dead skin because the subcutaneous fatty tissue is pushing outward and making flakes, and the flakes fall off, and every 30 days, all of the cells in my skin are regenerated. They're completely replaced every 30 days. So regeneration is the continual expression of life to reproduce the conditions of being alive from moment to moment. And if we understand what this is, corporations can say whatever the hell they want. We know that to regenerate Cascadia means to restore the living processes of our rivers and our mountains, our watersheds, our hydrological systems, our precipitation patterns. So regeneration here means to restore the health and vitality of the living systems of this place. And then the word Cascadia is probably well known to everyone in this room. This is the best known bioregion on Earth, right here. I'm from another one of the well-known bioregions. I grew up in Missouri in a place called the Ozarks. And the Ozarks had their first bioregional congress. If I remember correctly, it was 1981, something like that. And so there's a relationship between Cascadia and the Ozarks that I didn't discover until a few years ago. So I'm actually born in one of the cool bioregions, and now I'm hanging out in another one. And so Cascadia has a very long history. And we're going to talk today about what it would mean to do regeneration at this scale. To start doing this, I want to begin by reminding us of something many other people have said before, which is that when you look at the Earth from space, you will notice a complete absence of borders. They just don't exist. They're total fictions. Our nation states, our jurisdictions, our political boundaries are complete fabrications. They're enforced by guns and taxation and other things, but they're fictions. When you look at the Earth from space, you'll notice a holistic, integrated, and interdependent system. If I asked you which pixels have water in this scene, notice the ocean is full of water, but on land there are rivers and lakes. In the atmosphere there are clouds, but even where there are no clouds, there's water vapor. So there's water in every single pixel of this image. And in fact, with subduction zones, where the ocean floor goes below the continental plates, water is pulled down into the magma and cycles and is released as steam in our volcanoes, which means water is even inside the Earth. Water integrates the entire life system of the planet. This is important because the interdependencies of the planet create systemic risk. And the systemic risk is something that we are now living through and that is of great, great significance. So when we talk about regenerating Cascadia, we need to talk about why. do we need to work at such a large scale? Why is it that a smaller scale won't suffice? And to be able to answer that question, I like to use a framework called the planetary boundaries. Just by a show of hands, who has heard of the planetary boundaries? So most of you. The planetary boundaries is a really powerful framework that helps us see where we are with the state of the planet. This is a framework that was created by the Stockholm Resilience Center, which represents about 3,500 scientists who study the dynamic Earth. And back in 2009, they asked a very interesting question. The question was this: with everything that we know about the dynamic Earth, are there any thresholds that if that threshold was crossed, we would destabilize our warm, stable climate of the Earth and leave the conditions that made it possible to have large-scale agriculture, urban centers, complex societies, globalized trade networks? Which is to say, are there any thresholds that would take us out of a safe operating space for humanity at a planetary scale? So they gathered all the researchers, and they convened conferences, and they published papers, and they came back and said, okay, there are 9. There are 9 planetary boundaries, and if we cross even one, we leave this safe space. Climate change is only one of them. We talk a lot about climate change, but it's only one. There's also biosphere integrity, which is what happens when you have an increasing rate of extinction for species, which causes a pruning of ecosystems until the ecosystems unravel. This is the mass extinction event. Then there's land system change, which is when you take complex, healthy ecosystems and degrade them through desertification, through deforestation, creating agriculture, urban landscapes, degraded landscapes. So land system change is the third. Then there's freshwater use. Only 1% of all of the water in the world is freshwater. 99% is saltwater. So that freshwater needs to be kept clean and accessible and flowing, because if there's not enough fresh water, not going to be complex social systems. Then there's biogeochemical flows, which is reactive nitrogen and phosphorus used in synthetic fertilizers, which then flow into our rivers, run into our ocean, and create huge apoxic zones, which cause dead zones in the world ocean. And if there's enough of this that happens, it collapses the food chain from its very base in the world ocean. Then there's ocean acidification. If the ocean becomes too acidic, calcium carbonate begins to dissolve. Calcium carbonate is what's used to make the bodies of coral for all of our coral reefs. It's what's used to make the bones and hard tissues of clams and mollusks. So if the ocean becomes too acidic, it will dissolve the bodies of our hard-bodied exoskeleton organisms in the world ocean. Atmospheric aerosol loading is just a fancy way of saying air pollution. If there's too much air pollution, that would create a problem for us. Then there's stratospheric ozone depletion. You know, in the stratosphere, there's a layer of ozone that absorbs the ultraviolet radiation. And if that UV were to make it to the surface, there'd be no life on land for any of our continents. So we need this ozone layer. Then there's a 9th one called novel entities, which is chemicals created by humans that the planet doesn't know what to deal with. So there are 9. They came up with these 9, and there's a natural question, right? Like, okay, there are 9 planetary boundaries. We cross even one, we're in trouble. So how are we doing? So they went and did the research, had the conferences, published the papers, gathered the data, and in 2015, they found that we had crossed 4. We'd crossed the planetary boundaries for climate change, the rate of extinction, the destruction of ecosystems, what's called land system change, and the biochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. But then the research continued, and the peer review research process takes a while, so there are time delays. So in 2021, they came back and said, actually, we've crossed the boundaries for freshwater use and ocean acidification. Now, it doesn't mean we crossed it during that time. It's just that it's really hard to answer these questions. They had to gather a lot of data. They had to have lots of debates, and they came back and found this. Then in 2022, they added novel entities because of microplastics. Microplastics are long-lived chemical polymers that can be found in every drop of breast milk of every woman on Earth and in every water supply on Earth. They even find them in clouds above mountains. So we're going to be dealing with microplastics for a long time. Now, this is a snapshot of the state of the Earth today. Notice that this does not say we have until 2030 to get carbon dioxide levels down to 350 parts per million and everything's fine, right? So our environmental discourse is pretty much a complete sham. It's completely disconnected from the reality of what we know about the state of the world. Now, when I look at this, the story that this image tells me is that we are not going to find our way to planetary sustainability by changing our light bulbs. We're not going to get to planetary sustainability by buying an electric car or any other green consumer product. What this story tells us is that nothing less than the complete reimagining of the human presence as part of the Earth is going to do. We must reimagine what it means to be human as part of the planet if we want to deal with this. Which means we have to think at very large scales and we have to do very complex work. Human extinction is actually one of the risks of where this story goes. And so that's where we are. We're at a place where we have not only destabilized the Earth's climate, we've messed up its ocean, we've destroyed a lot of its ecosystems, we've polluted a lot of it, and we've changed the chemical composition of the ocean. How does this work? How do these planetary boundaries work? This is a graphic that summarizes the tipping points of the Earth system. Now, tipping points are parts of the Earth system that if a threshold is crossed, then there are these cascading changes. So let's go through a few examples. I'm not going to explain all of them, but look, the Greenland ice sheet. Too much global warming causes the Greenland ice sheet to melt, which can cause sea level rise. But if that fresh water runs into the North Atlantic too quickly, it disrupts the mixing of the North Atlantic Ocean, shutting down the Great Conveyor Belt, which would cause all of our weather systems to become chaotic. So those are two of our tipping points. There's also the boreal forest, which spans the Arctic Circle, the largest forest in the world. If our forest of the north dries out too much, it begins a massive dieback, causing the release of greenhouse gases. I don't know if you all noticed the pattern of forest fires in Canada this year. We're beginning the dieback of the boreal forest. We also have the collapse of the Amazon rainforest due to deforestation, which is on schedule to permanently shift to grassland savanna for the first time in 40 million years within the next 2 years. We're very, very close to the tipping point for the Amazon rainforest to completely collapse. Then you have the West Antarctic ice sheet. If that ice sheet falls into the ocean, sea level rises by 4 or 5 meters. Then you have permafrost, where there are 4 meters thickness of frozen vegetation in the tundra of Siberia. Frozen vegetation does not decompose, so as it warms, it begins to decompose. The microbes that have huge amounts of methane. There are explosive craters of methane making big holes in the Earth in Eastern Asia right now. So these are tipping points of the Earth system. Notice this doesn't say anything about tipping points of social systems, which is a whole other set of risks we have to deal with. This is how the planetary boundaries are defined. They're defined with respect to these tipping points. That if we don't stay within a safe operating range, we cause some of these to be crossed. Several of these tipping points are being crossed right now. And as some of them are crossed, they increase the likelihood that there's a cascade causing others to be crossed. So this is where we are in the world right now. And let's look at an example to see how this works. This is a simple example of one of the tipping points. The ice in the Arctic Ocean. So if you have global warming, which is amplified in the Arctic, then you cause the air to be warmer, which causes Arctic ice to melt. But ice reflects 90% of sunlight into space. If you remove the ice over the ocean, dark blue ocean absorbs 90% of sunlight. So this reduction in sea ice completely changes the amount of heating in the Arctic. So as you reduce the sea ice, you absorb more heat, which causes more warming. This is a positive feedback. This is a self-amplifying loop. So the question becomes, what happens when there's no longer sea ice in the Arctic Ocean during the summer of the Northern Hemisphere, which is on schedule to happen by around 2030, in the next couple of years. So what happens? This dark red area is the jet stream. The jet stream is what brings our weather. Where it rains, it follows the jet stream. And notice the shape, this characteristic capital omega. That is the shape that gives you the rainy season in the Pacific Northwest. So what happens if the Arctic Ocean stops having ice during the summer and there's a very significant change in its heating and mixing? It causes all of the jet streams to become turbulent and chaotic, and this characteristic weather pattern that defines your region could break down and go away. So what you can see here is that the Earth is a whole system. There are interdependencies and relationships from one part of the Earth to another, and there can be cascading consequences across the Earth. There can be time delays of decades, and the breakdown unfolds across space and time. This is why we have so much systemic risk. But notice there's a word in here, across. Across space and time means changes to one part of the planet have cascading effects to other parts of the planet. And this is where there's a silver lining to this story. The silver lining is look how much we know about how the Earth works. Look how good our knowledge of the Earth is getting. And because changes happen across places, if we can regenerate more than one place at a time, we can restore some of the connections that exist through the interdependencies of the Earth. Just like how the melting of sea ice to the north can cause weather patterns to change further south, we can take this knowledge and apply it to creating regenerative actions in multiple places at the same time. So I've traveled a lot around the world. I've visited a lot of regenerative projects. And what I've noticed is all of them take place within the boundaries of a plot of land. You have a great permaculture project. You have a really nice reforestation effort. You have riparian restoration on a river. And there's a boundary for the plot of land. The problem with this is that every plot of land is embedded within larger ecological connections. For example, your permaculture project could be in a watershed, and someone could drop chemicals upstream, and then they run across your project. There are ecological connections. What's beautiful is those connections are already self-organized into holistic landscapes. Things like watersheds, things like coastal estuaries, things like mountain ranges, things like island chains, things like annual precipitation patterns, like monsoons. So there are larger holistic landscapes that organize our ecological connections. But those landscapes are embedded within larger planetary processes, such as the evaporation of moisture in the Pacific that brings the rain hundreds or couple thousand miles away. So the larger planetary processes are how the landscapes are connected to each other. When I went looking for a pathway to planetary sustainability, I realized that there is no pathway that exists at any of these levels. It doesn't exist at any of them. But then I started to squint my eyes and think a little bit differently, and I realized the pathway exists in the relationships across them. So let's say you have a beautiful permaculture farm, and it is on a plot of land that's in a watershed. But there are other regenerative projects in the same watershed, and you can begin to look for the ecological connections among them through the holistic landscapes that they're a part of. And you can start to work across levels. And as you start to work across levels, you begin to see that there is a pathway that connects from the local to the landscape to the larger planetary connections and back down again. And so the way that this works is that there's a very, very simple principle of profound significance, which is this: everything that happens anywhere on Earth happens somewhere. That seems kind of like redundant and like simple, right? Everything that happens anywhere on Earth happens somewhere. But we've already seen that the Earth has all of these interdependencies between places, which means every place where we are can become a place to start to restore resilience and restore connections. So, if everything happens somewhere, a good question to ask is, where are we? Where are we? And on this map, we're right there, right? You're somewhere. Now, what's interesting is that each place has a profound capacity for transformation. An absolutely profound capacity for transformation. So let's look at the place we're in. Here we are in Port Townsend, and you can see there's a lot of structure. There's a lot of complexity to this place, right? There's the shape of the water and the islands and the coastline. There's a lot of structure here that we can work with in this place. And when we zoom out, it's like, whoa, look at that. There's so much here. The complexity that we have to work with is already embedded in the Earth's structures, in the Earth's organizing patterns. The way it works is like this. If you start with a place, any place on Earth, that place has a unique geologic history that tells you how that place came to be. Every place on Earth has a unique ecological history that tells you the kind of life that exists, the kind of ecosystems that exist in this place. Every place, if there are humans, has a unique cultural history. And as you start to learn about the geologic, cultural, and ecological history of a place, you begin to construct a story of that place. A story with incredible uniqueness and incredible richness. And as you learn the story of your place, you begin to gain holistic, whole system understandings of that place. How does life work here? If humans have lived here for a while, did they live sustainably, and how did they do it? What kind of life is appropriate to this place? If I'm going to plant trees, what kinds of trees should I plant? What kinds of rocks and soils exist here? All of this is part of the story of place. But here's the amazing thing. This story is not over. It's not static. It's not finished. The story is unfolding right now. All of us in this room are part of the story of this place. Because if you arrive into a place, you enter its unfolding story. So now we can make the noun into a verb, and we can talk about storying the place, living out the story of place. And as we do this, as we construct these whole system understandings, we can begin to imagine regenerative futures. We can begin to imagine the holistic health of the life of every single place. So if we're here in Port Townsend, like there's a unique geologic, ecological, and cultural history. We can cultivate an understanding of the story. What is this place? What does it mean to live here? What is the legacy that I will pass on? What is the future that I want to see created? And it might be, for example, oh, there's a river that used to have salmon in it. In the future, I'd like there to be salmon again. You can start to imagine these futures where the life systems are restored. And because the history, you might say it's empirical, it's verifiable, you can create shared understandings of the place. And with those shared understandings, you can work towards shared futures. So the power of place is incredible for transformation. Let's look at an example of this. So this is an image I took from Google Earth. She's almost 7 years old and she loves to draw. She took some crayons. She'd like come in here and say, oh, it's those. Those are the most degraded places. You can see them, right? It's in the valleys. It's in the watersheds. And 10 miles long, 3 or 4 miles across. This is a human scale. There might be about 100 pieces of property there, 100 landowners. So you could imagine walking around in this valley, meeting the people who live there, gathering and convening them, and asking what would it take to regenerate this valley. And then you can imagine a process of finding the ecological connectivity, As you always do with water when you're doing restoration, you start uphill and work your way down. There are a number of principles that are involved. And you begin to see that this is a human scale of organization that is completely doable and has actually been done many times before. And you start to see that this is a scale. Portland here, Eugene there, it's about 100 miles north to south, maybe 50 miles east to west. This is Western Oregon. It's a terribly degraded landscape. But if you were to ask the question, how would we regenerate something so large? But then you look and see where are the most degraded places, and once again, look at those valleys, look at those watersheds. And remember the three of them that I showed before, there they are, just outside of Eugene. Now I didn't color all of them in, but let's say maybe there are 40 or 50 of them. That's 40 or 50 projects to be done in parallel, each place organizing its own valley. And now we see the patterning of how the land is shaped and now the land tells us how to regenerate itself. And this is how you would begin to regenerate the Willamette Valley. But now if we go out a level, the Willamette Valley drains into the Columbia River. This is the Columbia River Basin, 258,000 square miles, about the same size as the entire drainage of the Colorado River. 174 rivers drain into the Columbia River. This is huge. But notice, right there is the Willamette Valley. And we start to see the nestedness of reality, that you could actually repeat the same patterns that I showed you for the Willamette Valley for all of the Columbia Basin. And we could regenerate the entire Columbia Basin. See, the land is already organized and it shows us how to organize ourselves. We just organize ourselves the way that the land brings life. And watersheds are phenomenal for doing this. So when we look at the watersheds of Cascadia, this blue area is the Columbia Basin, this yellow area is the Fraser River, and then there are many others, but you can see it's the same idea. This is a powerful way to organize local landscapes, to build regenerative economies, to restore the life systems of place. So now imagine a mycelial web of regeneration that spreads across all of Cascadia. So we're on this Regenerate Cascadia tour. We're visiting a lot of places. So imagine if every place we visit, people start organizing around the regeneration of their landscapes. And they start collaborating with each other across their watersheds to restore larger systems like entire rivers. And this becomes so exciting, the people down in the Snake River get wind of it, and they decide maybe they should do that too. And pretty soon, we have the pattern for organizing the regeneration of all of Cascadia. So this is what we're talking about, is how to reorganize and reimagine the human presence as part of the earth. Work. Yes, we structure ourselves around the patterns of landscapes, but we also have to structure human organization. So we need to talk a little bit about the structures for how to regenerate bioregions. How does this work? How do we do this? So let's start. Again, we organize by the land. One of the things we need to create is bioregional learning centers, which is places where you learn the rich and holistic story of your place. And you monitor and track its progress as you're regenerating it. So we need to create bioregional learning centers. We have to structure our education about the life systems of our place. And we need to create territorial governance. We need to create governance about how to set priorities, how to make decisions, how to allocate resources in service to the life systems of our place. We do this by creating tapestries of local projects organized as landscapes, and by creating ecosystems of learning organized as landscapes. So let's look at how this works. Well, first, before we do, so I want to stress that this implies a lot of cooperation, which means we have to design pro-social contexts. What do I mean by that? I mean we have to create shared identity and purpose. For example, do we want salmon in this river? That could be a shared purpose, and those who want salmon in the river is a shared identity. So we need shared identity and purpose. We need fair and inclusive decision making. We need fast and fair conflict resolution. right? We need the context in which we can be trusting and cooperative, generous, so that we can build these exchanges together. So we have to design. So before going any further, I want to just stop and sort of go back. Is a bioregion. So the word bioregion is just short for biological region, or some people, for them it means biocultural region. But biocultural is just biological and cultural. Cultural is the social behavior of animals or sometimes plants, which are biological, so it's still biological regeneration. Which is to say, a bioregion is the geographic space in which the entire life context brings life and well-being to a population of any living organism. So it's the entire life context for the biological population to exist. I'll use an example that's easy to understand. Let's talk about starfish. Starfish have a very clear geographic range. They live within the intertidal zone of our coastlines. Between the high tide and the low tide, usually in tidal pools, is where they find all of their food, their shelter, where they find mates, where they reproduce, and the entire birds. For deer and elk, for bears, for oak trees, for a forest with California redwoods. And so a bioregion is the geographic realm that holds the entire life context for the organism. Interesting with humans, because the geographic range for the entire life system of humans depends on cosmovision and worldview. It depends on model of social organization. It depends on the kind of technology and how this relates to the structures of economy and politics, which is to say that human bioregions have a very strong cultural component. And actually the bioregionalism movement is filled with debates about the boundaries of bioregions for exactly this reason, which is probably a very healthy thing, because bioregions should be constructed as a political identity for the people living within a place. And so when we think of a bioregion in this way, by definition, every bioregion is a model for the whole system of life for its own regeneration. Said another way, if a bioregion is the entire life context, the geography of the entire life context, by definition, that is what makes it regenerative, because the dynamic patterns of regeneration exist at that scale. Which means the only way to create sustainable human cultures is create them as bioregions, QED, as I defined before. Because the definition of a bioregion is the definition of the holistic scale at which sustainability is possible. Which means the only scale at which humans could become sustainable or to actually have regenerative cultures is if we organize our cultural systems as bioregions. See how that works? It's just like the biological definition says, therefore it's true. It's like that's how it works. So we need to organize our economies and our cultures as bioregions if we want to become sustainable. So what needs to happen is this. We need to recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of material flows. Integrated life systems means humans with the rest of nature, and we need thriving families and communities. But what's interesting is if you look at a map like this one, this is a map of ecozones. Ecozones are, what kind of soil and climate and what kind of ecosystem exists in a place. And notice every color represents a different ecozone. It doesn't matter what they are for our purposes, just notice there's more than one. Which means you should expect, because there's a diversity of ecosystem types, that there should be a diversity of human cultures and a diversity of human economies around the world, each one adapted to its place. Well, this is actually what our best sustainability thinkers had to say from the 1970s. Because in 1972, a very important study was conducted where they created the very first computer simulation of the global economy. This study was called Limits to Growth, and they ran a scenario called business as usual. So where that phrase comes from is from that study. Business as usual was not supposed to be a forecast. It was a scenario. But we've actually tracked it almost perfectly for the last 50 years. The scenario shows the human population reaching its peak around 2040. It starts to slow down from 2030, and then it very quickly declines after that as the human population crashes. And so this study created a lot of controversy and a lot of debate. So the best thinkers of the time, who were trying to figure out how to create human presence within the limits of the planet to create planetary sustainability, they gathered at a place in Hungary called Lake Balaton. So they called themselves the Balaton Group. And for the next 10 years, they had meetings all over the world trying to figure out, what do we do to live within planetary limits? And after 10 years, Dana Meadows, who is the lead author of that study, wrote a little essay. It was called A Brief History of the Balaton Group. And it started being shared around as a PDF in the last couple of years, so it's resurfacing. And this is a quote from that essay. Vernon Rutten was an economist from the group, and he said, each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each place. And then Dana Meadows went on to say, out of these 10 years of meetings came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. So she said this in 1983, 40 years ago. I was 6 years old when they wrote this. Now, what they're basically saying is we have to organize the human presence on Earth as local living economies organized as bioregions with bioregional learning centers in every one of our bioregions. Now, has anyone come up with a better way to get to planetary sustainability since 1983? The answer is no. No, this is the only way. It's the only way. So what happened after 1983 was major environmental topics disappeared from the discourse. We stopped talking about human population. We stopped talking about consumption. We started talking about technical issues like the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so that technocratic solutions could be created, so business as usual could continue for as long as possible. And for 40 years, we have actually known the only way to become sustainable as a species, as part of this planet. Organize ourselves as bioregional living economies and have bioregional learning centers in each place. So I want to show you a little bit, how does this work? What does it look like? With an example in another bioregion. This is a topographic map of the country of Colombia. This is the northern Andes. In this region that's colored in, that's where I live. I live in a place right in the middle of it called Barichara, which is a Guane word from the indigenous people of that region. Barichara means the place of rest. It's a ceremonial place for deep healing and deep connection. Now, this is a place that has 3 large mountain ranges. On the west, over here, is this tall mountain range where there's a cloud forest, but there's a rain shadow, which means all the clouds rise up, all the rain drops, and it's dry on the other side. And then there's a tall mountain range over here on the east and another to the north, making this triangle. And the only place where the moisture can get in is from the south. And as it comes in, it runs up against the mountains and creates a rotation, which means there's a well-defined climatic system within those mountain ranges on the scale of about 500,000 hectares. It's like 25 miles by 25 miles. And within that region is a unique ecosystem like no other on Earth called the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. And the research they've done in this region shows that it's 80% endemic, which means 8 out of 10 species exist nowhere else on Earth. And this tropical dry forest is more than 95% deforested to create monoculture agriculture in the last 80 years, which means the whole region is becoming a desert. And so when we talk about regenerating a bioregion, this is a really nice, well-defined system. There's actually been a human presence with archaeological evidence going back at least 7,000 years. This is a place where humans have lived for a long time. This is the region where cotton comes from, and also where tobacco comes from, 2 very important sacred plants. The peace pipe of North America comes from tobacco traded with the peoples of the northern Andes of South America. So this is a place of great historical significance. And we wanted to ask ourselves, how do we regenerate this? So this is Barichara. Its tourism slogan is the prettiest town in Colombia, which is probably true because it's a really beautiful place. And this is a photo that I took from up here in the foreground is a place called Bioparque Moncora, which is a community reforestation project. This whole area in the foreground used to look like this section of exposed clay and rock in 2009. And it's in the process of becoming native forest again. And so when I arrived in Barichara in November of 2019, so about 4 years ago, I started to do the permaculture thing, which is you show up and you don't intervene, and you observe what's happening, and then you start to work with the patterns that are there. Right, this is the ethic of caring for what's in place. So I started to notice, wow, there are a lot of great regenerative projects here, but they're not talking to each other, they don't know about each other, and they're not collaborating. So this is partly because Colombia, some of you may know, in the last century had a period that lasted about 58 years called La Violencia, the time of violence, where it was basically homegrown terrorism with these multipolar traps of multiple generations of people killing each other indiscriminately on the streets, which means the Colombian people have good reason to keep their heads down, not trust their neighbors, and not be very good at cooperating. So when I showed up, I started identifying the projects that had a good track record of success, people that had demonstrated they were getting things done. And then I started to mobilize resources with crowdfunding, and then use the money to bring them together. I actually had a really great lure. I was like, hi everyone, I'm the white guy from the north. I just gathered money. Would you guys help me spend this so I don't screw it up? It was awesome. So we had representatives from 15 local projects that figured out the criteria and the priorities and how best to allocate the money. And we ended up funding about 20 local projects and helping to weave them together. So what we started to do was started to look at how to organize the projects at the landscape scale. So how does this work? For us to organize projects at the landscape scale, we have to have patterns that we can use for the integration. Here are 4 of the patterns that we used. One of them is the restoration of entire watersheds. See, in Barichara, all of the rivers are dead. They're dead. Either they've completely dried up, and when it rains, the water just rushes down to the valley below, causing massive erosion, or they're so contaminated with pollutants that nothing can live in them. This is actually really common across all of Latin America, much of Africa, and many other parts of the world. So all these dead rivers. So if we're going to restore entire watersheds, that means we need to create watershed councils. We need to engage in soil building, watershed restoration, and reforestation at the watershed scale. So this is a pattern within the territory that we can use to organize our work. Second pattern we started to work with was by creating a learning center in syntropic agroforestry. So syntropic agroforestry is a method developed in Brazil. It's the fastest way to create a climax ecosystem. The way that you do it is you select the composition of species so that you minimize the competition for niches and maximize the cooperation between them, and have very labor-intensive pruning techniques to cycle biomass and build the soils. So it's the fastest way to grow a forest to climax. But it's also very labor-intensive and very knowledge-intensive. What's interesting about it, though, is that we could use syntropic agroforestry as a pattern. Because what we did is we invited syntropic teachers, we offered workshops. In the workshop, we'd have the participants set up a demonstration site. There'd be a community site for practicing and training in syntropic agroforestry. And then the participants, many of them, owned their own private land. So they'd be practicing syntropic agroforestry on their land. And then we do technical field site visits where all of the people who had attended the workshops would go and help building techniques and knowledge on everyone else's land. And we would create patterns of exchange across the landscape. And this leads us to the transformation of local food systems. So Barichara has got a population of about 6,000 people. It's pretty small. But amazingly, 70% of the food that's eaten in the town grows within 10 kilometers away, like 6 miles, which is kind of amazing because most places it's less than 3%. And because of the amount of deforestation, as we put in agroforestry systems which allow us to grow food, textiles and natural fibers, medicinal plants and construction materials, the material basis of a local economy, that we can actually grow our food shed with reforestation. So we're working on transforming the local food system to get to 100% food security. And then the other thing we're doing is working on the design of alternative economic models based on solidarity exchanges and trust, creating processes of time banking, a community store with about 80 local producers who bring in their goods, which is food, cosmetics, textiles. And then in that store, they're creating a community currency and a community fund, and we're prototyping different ways of engaging in economic exchange. And just with these 4 patterns, you can start to see how we're creating a regenerative economy at the landscape scale. So what does this look like? Well, there's something that I've discovered in regenerative work is that everything regenerative, no matter what you're doing, involves education. It's all about learning different ways of doing things. And so in Barichara, we have some really powerful ways that we engage in education. One of the ways that we do it, as this guy here on the goatee named Felipe has been doing, is he started a process called Caminatas del Agua, which is water walks. He took children between the ages of 4 and 10, and he got permission from landowners to have the children walk through the dead rivers and streams and walk across people's land, and then the children would interview the adults and ask them what happened to the water. And the adults would have to say, as they say in Spanish, que pena, what a shame. We started fighting and killing our neighbors, and we had this long period of time where we were fighting with each other, and during that time the water went away. We cut down all the trees to grow tobacco, and then the tobacco destroyed our soils, and then we put goats on it, on steep hills, and it eroded all the soils away, and then the water disappeared. And the adults had a cracking open of their hearts and a reemergence of conscience about water that was created by the children. And then the children said, we want to restore the rivers. And so we started gathering adults who had expertise to guide the children. And like in this image here, the man on the right is an indigenous elder from the Muisca culture based in Bogota, which is that we bring in indigenous elders who can provide guidance and mentorship and support to the children and how to restore right relationships with the river. And as we do this, really interesting things start to happen. The kids start to come up with ways to restore the river. This little girl here, her name is Quetzal. And in this picture, she's 6 years old. She's actually 7 now. It's a picture from last year. And she's holding up a list of things that they could do to restore the Barichara River. There's some really cool ideas in there. I'll tell you my favorite one. When she said, well, what if we take grass and bundle it up like hay, and we put some mushrooms in it, and we put it in the river, and we can gather the contaminants? Because Quetzal likes to watch YouTube videos about microremediation with her dad. This is the 21st century, after all. So the kids have really good ideas, but the key to this is that the adults have to take the children seriously. The children need to have adults that say, damn, Quetzal, that's a good idea, let's try that out. And that's exactly what the adults are doing. So you see, this education moves in very strange and surprising ways. Now this other image is about another really important principle that we use in Barichara. This is Gabriela and her granddaughter Soraya. One of the things we do in Barichara, whenever possible, is when the adults are having an important conversation, we have the children play in the center of the circle, where the adults are gathered. There are 2 reasons for this. One is that when these kids grow up, we want them to remember what the adults were talking about. The other reason is that the adults have a direct reminder of how to be in integrity with their decisions and who they're making decisions for. This completely changes how we make decisions in our community by simply having the children play among us. We don't separate the children from the adults in making important decisions about our community. So you see, this way of doing regenerative education shows that we have 2 surprising teachers. The land, because these kids already have conscience. No one had to teach it to them. It's the adults who forgot. And so when I look at projects like that Bioparque Moncora that I told you about, that community reforestation project, it's this sort of odd-shaped thing right over here. So that's a project that's been going since 2009. They're reforesting, they're creating a native forest. There are a lot of middle school and high school kids from the public schools that come and participate. And then this other project right here next to it is a project called Fundación Monte Chico. What's interesting is there's a hiking trail that connects the two, and you can walk from one to the other in less than 5 minutes. Fundación Monte Chico is a place where they offer workshops for 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in bioconstruction, textiles, and natural fibers. Seems like a good partner to Bioparque Moncora, but when I arrived in Barichara, they didn't know about each other and they were not collaborating. So this need for creating a landscape scale of vision and bringing people together may not come from the projects themselves. So here's another interesting thing. If I showed you a picture like this, where it's like these are different regenerative projects in Barichara, and they're all different. Like over here is Kane Calibri, which is a community theater project where they have indigenous storytelling to instill in children the conscience and nature connection for how to care for their place. Over here is Corasoma, which is a trauma healing group that works with women and violence in their homes. And then you have Agua Santa down here, which is a regenerative agriculture project that's also restoring a watershed. So when you look at projects like this, they're all really diverse and different from each other. So the question becomes, how would you organize them? Which ones should work with each other? And it's not obvious. But when you look at them on a map and you discover that right down here is that community theater, and right there is one of the regenerative agriculture projects, and they're both in the same watershed. They're both in the same drainage, which means you could create an educational program for children who live in that area to learn things through the community theater and then work with the regenerative farm, and the land shows us how to connect them. So we can organize by the landscape. The landscape shows us how to organize ourselves. And so this leads back to, what is a bioregional learning center really? How is this different from other kinds of education? A bioregional learning center is about the coordination of learning processes, which means they may not even create new education programs. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But what's more important is that you create coordination and coherence among all of the different ways of learning in your bioregion. What are all of the ways we learn about this place, and how can we get them to work together in a coherent way? That would be the work of a bioregional learning center. Another thing would be mapping and knowledge sharing, which is creating these gatherings of coherent knowledge to be shareable among places. And the mapping can be many kinds. It can be social, it can be ecological, or there can be many kinds of mapping. And a bioregional learning center gathers this information and helps to tell these stories to bring coordination to the learning processes. And as a result, the bioregional learning center becomes a gateway into community activities. So you arrive in the community and you say, I really care about trauma healing. Oh, go work with this group over here. I'm really interested in trees and reforestation. Oh, you should work with this group over here. This coordination among educational processes creates a wayfinding system. But that's not just for someone who arrives from the outside. Let's say you're a member of the community and you decide you want to get involved. You can go to the Bioregional Learning Center to learn how the knowledge is organized across your landscape, and then enter into it in the places that you care most about. But this includes, so this isn't just like hippies and permaculture projects, which are super important. It includes advanced modeling and simulation. For example, here we are, the northern tip of the Olympic Peninsula in the Salish Sea, and there's going to be a big earthquake. And there are advanced computational facilities that run simulations of earthquakes and tsunami risk. This is bioregional learning. This is knowledge about the story of your place. So advanced scientific research is part of a bioregional learning center. But also, oh gosh, indigenous perspectives and the decolonization of knowledge. Who knows best how to live in this place? The people who have been here for a while. So this decolonization and these indigenous perspectives are super important. Now what I found by talking to indigenous leaders is that they all agree that we actually need both. We need the best of scientific knowledge together with the indigenous wisdom traditions, stories, ethical development. They need to come together. Because science doesn't tell us how to be ethical. But scientific knowledge can really inform how we apply our ethics in the care of the landscapes where we live. So we need to bring these two together. Notice that bioregional learning centers are both centralized and decentralized. Centralized in the sense that if you're going to gather knowledge into a shared database, there's a centralization, maybe a standardization of how the data is gathered, how the stories are reported, pedagogical frameworks for putting it together. But that is so that you can have decentralized autonomous activities that work in a coherent way as an ecosystem. So it's both centralized and decentralized. So this is some of what a bioregional learning center is about. We had a great conversation this morning, Rick and I were just riffing on it, about how Fort Worden could become a bioregional learning center. I think it'd be a pretty amazing one. That might be something we could talk about afterwards. So how does this relate to territorial governance? What are the structures and processes that give rise to the governance of a bioregion? Well, once again, you start with the mapping and weaving of local projects. What are the regenerative projects in this watershed? How could they work together? How could they organize themselves? Now, why is this about governance? How do you learn about those projects? You gather the leaders and the representatives who are in those projects, and you get them sharing information with each other, which leads to identifying needs that are shared across projects and priorities that need to be addressed together. You're beginning to create heuristics and frameworks for decision making simply by mapping and weaving the local projects. And as you identify needs and priorities, you can begin to form multi-stakeholder groups, landscape level partnerships. So if we're going to return the salmon to a river, we need educators, we need farmers, we need conservation managers, we need fish biologists. You know, like we need different kinds of stakeholders to come together and form partnerships. In the forming of partnerships, we're creating governance. As this happens, you quickly discover that you need to create community funding structures. And why is this? Because who knows best how to allocate resources in the community? Well, the members of the landscape partnerships who are in the local projects who are connected to the activity on the ground. And this doesn't just apply to money. This applies to any kind of value that could be exchanged. So let's say we have this great example that was from someone in Seattle on our tour, which is that Earth Corps is a program where high schoolers who need to fulfill some community service requirements can go and volunteer on conservation or restoration projects. So one way to do this is to allocate those human labor hours to a project. This is a community funding structure. As we do this, we begin to mobilize resources in service to the whole, which is to say, instead of every project competing for scarce resources, we dynamically create circulation that grows our capacity to govern together and to allocate resources together. This is how we create sovereignty. It's a very important point. Sovereignty is not just a right someone has. Sovereignty is created together as a capacity to guide directions in an agent-filled and empowered way. We cultivate our sovereignty by going through this process. As we're building up these capacities, our sovereignty increases. And this is what strengthens our collaboration internally and creates a governing system. And so there are a lot of elements and structures for how to do this, but the bioregional learning process creates territorial governance and creates local economies. And this leads us to a framework that I want to very briefly talk about, which is how do we fund this? How would we regenerate an entire watershed? So I have a friend named Willem Verweerde who created this organization called Common Land Foundation. And he used to be the director of IUCN, which is the Global Organization for Biodiversity. And he noticed that you'd have these great projects, and as soon as the funding for the projects ran out, you could just cue the chainsaws. It's like, oh, we need funding for processes, not projects. It was like, where do people, like, does anyone ever create large pools of funding to do large, complex projects that last multiple decades? Like, are there any projects that maybe have $1 billion budget and that they last over 30 years? And the answer is yes, there are lots of them. They're called infrastructure projects. As Brandon and I were talking about it, the third expansion of the light rail system around Seattle cost $58 billion. And that light rail system is a process unfolding over 30 years. So when Willem Verweerde started trying to raise funding for these large-scale projects, he went to his rich friends and found that they were basically ecological idiots. Like, they didn't understand ecological thinking at all, but they understood large-scale infrastructure projects. So he said, what if we wanted to fund the regeneration of an entire watershed and the creation of a regenerative economy? That might be a good idea. Well, just like in an infrastructure project, you need a core team that can manage the process, that manages the process during the whole time. Like, you needed someone to do hiring, someone to do legal, someone to do sourcing of resources, right? Like, you need process support during the whole time. So they started doing this in 2012 on landscapes of 100,000 hectares or larger. They're now working in about 25 of these large landscapes. 100,000 hectares or larger, 20 years or longer, and on average, you need about $2 million a year for your core team. But then, that doesn't fund it all. After that, you need to fund all the regenerative projects that become the basis of your economy. And the economy doesn't start to function for 8 to 10 years. Yeah, okay. And so this is a model that has been proven with data in multiple landscapes around the world that shows that with budgets of about $150 million, you can create a regenerative economy at a landscape scale. Which is not a bad deal if you think about it, because it's a pretty cost-effective way to create an economy. And it creates regenerative economies, which is pretty cool. So what we're talking about here is bioregional investment platforms, which is that you take those projects that are organized now as a tapestry, and you think of them as a portfolio, and then you diversify risk, because if there are 20 projects and one fails, 19 still succeeded, that's a good investment. And you're building capacities the whole time, even as they fail. So this idea is a way of raising large amounts of capital for projects, which is something we could talk more about. So it works like this. You have your bioregional learning center, which organizes all the learning about how to live in your place. You create territorial governance by figuring out how to identify needs and set priorities and allocate resources. You create an integrated framework for managing your landscapes as whole systems for watersheds and mountain ranges, estuaries. And this creates a robust circulation of value exchange between them. Or said another way, you weave the people in projects, you grow their cooperative abilities to work together, this deepens their organizing capacities, and you birth a regenerative economy at the scale of a bioregion. So there is a way to do this. There are structures that work at this scale. And so if you look at the Salish Sea, and you notice, look at all those watersheds. Do you think maybe we could do this in each of them? Do you think we could create tapestries of projects, organize governance, create learning ecosystems, create bioregional investment platforms, create governance? Well, here's an interesting thing. Just keep in mind, like, look at the general shape of those watersheds, and now look at this. This is a map of language families for First Nations people. Now, language families are a pretty good approximation for the extent of trade that lasted over a long period of time, because you create a shared language through economic and social exchange. And what you can notice is that the language families don't correspond exactly to watersheds, but it's pretty darn close, because people would cooperate within watersheds and among neighboring watersheds, which means this is a good approximation for bioregional organizing and regenerative economies for the Salish Sea. It just shows that this is something that's actually happened before and existed until it was destroyed by the colonizer culture that came here. Isn't it nice that most of those peoples are still here and they already knew how to do this? So this also reveals a very important role for restoring the sovereignty of Native peoples to help create regenerative economies for their own ancestral lands. A little social justice check mark. So this starts to show you the logic of what we're doing with our Regenerate Cascadia tour. Because see, we started at the beginning of the month in the Columbia River Gorge. Then we went to Eugene, having exactly the same conversation we're having tonight. Then we went to Portland. Then after Portland, we went to Olympia. After Olympia, we went to Vashon. After Vashon, we went to Seattle. After Seattle, we went to Whidbey Island. After Whidbey, we came across the ferry to Port Townsend. Tomorrow, we're going on to Victoria on Vancouver Island. Then we're going to Gabriola Island. Then we didn't add it because it just got added onto the conversation. We have 2 days. We're going to go to Ferry Creek and talk to some of the indigenous people there, some of the land protection work. Then we're going to Bellingham. Then we're going to Skagit Valley. And then we're going back to Seattle. And in the span of 30 days, we're going to create a mycelial pattern of conversations about how to regenerate Cascadia, to start to set in motion this patterning of organization. What's interesting is you go out a little bit further, like the scale of the entire continent, and look, North America is so interesting. It's organized by watersheds. So back in January and February, Penny and I, my partner Penny down here in the front, we decided to do a bioregional activation tour in the Great Lakes, in the Greater Takaranto bioregion in southern Ontario, in the Finger Lakes and Genesee River of upstate New York, and the Cuyahoga River in northeastern Ohio. And then the process has started to spread. And now there's going to be a summit in February for the regeneration of the Great Lakes. This process is beginning. Then in May and June, we made a trip from the headwaters of the Colorado River in the Rocky Mountains to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico, visiting communities along the way, talking about the regeneration of the Colorado River. About a month ago, there was a landscape leaders retreat from all of the communities we visited to explore how to create bioregional learning centers across the Colorado Basin. And here we are right now, activating conversations across Cascadia. Now notice what's happening. This is how you regenerate a continent. So conversations are already starting to bubble up in different parts of the biggest watershed, the Mississippi Basin. Because we have people in the Ogallala Aquifer in the Great Plains, people in the Driftless region in Wisconsin and Minnesota, people in the Rio Grande, which is actually a different system, this little green one down here, little green one, because the Mississippi is so big. And we start to see that there's a pattern for regenerating entire continents. So you take this way of organizing and say we could create bioregional networks for every continent on Earth. Now, because there's not much time and we're kind of in a rush, we might give Antarctica a pass. But otherwise, we could do this on all the other ones. And so this is how we regenerate the Earth. So Penny and I, back in March, created the Design School for Regenerating Earth with our other co-conspirator, Benji Ross. And the Design School for Regenerating Earth is about doing regeneration at this bioregional scale and creating learning exchanges between the landscapes so that we can support ourselves and do this, and support each other as bioregions to do this as quickly as possible. I've got a whole book about it that you could buy over here. But what's interesting is even if you don't read this book called The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, you're actually already in its pages just by being here tonight, because we're living out this design pathway, which is how do we create bioregional regenerative economies, a planetary network of bioregions, and organize across continents to regenerate the Earth. So this leads us to Regenerate Cascadia, which is the project that is organizing this tour. And I was wondering if Brandon might come up and just speak for a couple minutes, just a little bit about what Regenerate Cascadia is, and then we'll wrap up from there.
So, firstly, I think just thank you, Joe, for a wonderful presentation. And I think also thank you to Rick and Krista and Rose, and as well as Cindy and other local organizers here who helped put on this event and the event last night at the Finn River. So, a big thank you to all of you. And then I think the real question then is, what does all of this mean for here? So Joe, Penny, and Benji, they're doing an amazing job of starting to start these conversations about what does bioregional regeneration look like? How do we create bioregional activation teams around North America and the world? And through the design school, they're having those conversations in Colorado and the Great Lakes. And now as far as India and other parts of North America, Central America, and people are really leaning in, and they want to know. They want to know, how do we regenerate bioregions? And the great thing is for us, our question though is, what about here? How do we regenerate the Cascadia bioregion? How do we regenerate this watershed here in Port Townsend? What about Chimney? And so I'm a little bit bummed. Those of you who were here last night, you guys got to meet Claire in person. So my name is Brandon Letsinger, and for those of you who aren't familiar with myself and my work, I'm the founding director of Cascadia Now. I've been doing this work for about since 2005. I stepped away from that organization in about 2017, but in 2019 started a different organization called the Department of Bioregion, and we wanted to kind of dig in a little bit more to this idea of what are the different bioregions of the world, who are helping organize in those areas, and then also how do we keep Cascadia connected with this idea of bioregionalism. And so when I met Joe earlier this year, wow.
Well, we'd met like 10 years ago, but
That's true. When we
It had
connected
been a
in the
while.
design school earlier this year, it was a really wonderful conversation and discussion. Claire and I met, I mean, so all of this is very new, and it's emerging. And what's really fun is that this emerging process is starting here, and it's starting with all of you. So how do we regenerate this place? That's going to be a conversation for everybody in this room. Claire Atwell, my co-conspirator, we met earlier this year in April in the Salmon Nation Enterprise. It was an 8-week process which gathered 140 people from around the region who were doing really amazing work. She's a community-based artist in Victoria, and which is why she had to kind of run off ahead to kind of go make sure everything was ready. We're expecting, I think, our longest portion.
yeah, we're gonna run.
So there's going to be a lot going on, and a lot that she's activating. But when we met together in this enterprise, a few different things really emerged. There were 140 people meeting in this process over 8 weeks doing incredible work, and some of them were a mile away from each other, doing the same types of work, and they had never heard of each other or met each other. There's an incredible amount of silos that divide and categorize our work, and we really wanted to break that down, and then also to see this work really rooted and connected into place. I think especially with COVID and then other things in technology, a lot of times we're put online and on Zoom, and that's really wonderful. There was a really cool inspirational event that was held in November of last year called the Regenerative Communities Network Global Summit, which we got to participate in, and really amazing. 1,000 people, 140 different sessions from every different time zone that just went on. And the one thing that was missing is that it was disconnected from place. There was nothing rooted into the place. There was no connection with actual on-the-ground communities and organizations. And so for us, these became really design questions and challenges that we wanted to challenge ourselves with. What would it take to actually regenerate the Cascadia bioregion? How could we connect in with the communities that were actually doing the work, and then remove ourselves from the process, but create awareness so that they could connect with each other. And that's really how Regenerate Cascadia was born. And just to give you a sense of the scope and scale of this project, in April of this year, there were like 4 of us sitting in a room. It was Claire, myself, Joe, Penny, and then like 2 months ago, there were like 50 of us, hanging out on Zoom. And then like a month ago, it was like 100, and we're now at over like 300 people, in these 14 different communities and helping organize. And so people are really leaning into this process, and people are really curious. And so with that, our question then just really becomes, how do we grow Cascadia as a node of this emerging planetary network? How do we grow this watershed and as part of a bioregional network across all the watersheds of Cascadia? And more than just a bioregional network or another kind of collection, what we're really interested in doing is how do we grow a core team, both for the Cascadia bioregion as a whole, and then for every single watershed within our bioregion, for every ecoregion, for within the Salish Sea, for every watershed. How do we create bioregional learning centers?
And just as a comment, there are like 430 watersheds approximately in the Cascadia bioregion. So this is big.
So maybe we just start with a few, or 14.
Yeah, or something.
So I think within that, we're not just trying to compile kind of another list, but more than that, what does a core team actually do? Well, a core team does a few different things. Firstly, we're really interested in coming together to create a vision. We want to create a vision that's shared for our future, that we create together through, okay, let me start again. How do we create a vision that we grow together in each watershed that grows upwards, that we're each building together that comes from every different community? Two, how do we grow an informational commons? What are our bioregions? What are our watersheds? What are the bioregional frameworks that make sense in each area and for each different type of species or plant or animal? Someone needs to really be working to gather and collect those together. Once we start to have those bioregional frameworks, we can start to talk about the inputs and outputs. How much carbon is being produced? How much is being captured in each area? Are we being successful? Is it getting better every year? We can start to determine and actually have real metrics for impact. Once we have the bioregional frameworks, sometimes they make more sense than the existing arbitrary nation-state boundaries. We can actually use those bioregional frameworks as a tool for decolonization to break down arbitrary nation-state borders that maybe don't make sense. If we look a little bit north, or what we're going to be crossing tomorrow, is a big invisible line that crosses like a watershed. So maybe it makes more sense if we work together around the scale of an entire watershed, rather than having different governments, different data sets, so to the point where we can't even see a map or share information or language or other things. So standardizing language. These are all parts of what a core team could do. And then another part of that informational commons could actually be starting to create a regenerative movement map. Who are the people in the communities doing the work in each watershed? Who are the communities most impacted and affected who need to have a voice in this decision-making process? And then how do we start weaving those different projects together? And that leads us to the third thing that a core team can do, which is helping us create an accountable and transparent framework at the scale of a watershed, ecoregion, and bioregion that can help us administer an actual bioregional regeneration fund, but as determined and dictated by the actual communities themselves. So how do we help shift, as Joe was kind of saying, these large-scale capital projects to actually start building a regenerative economy where the people in this room get to actually say what the projects are in the community that are important, and they get to work together to co-create that budget. And what's really nice is that as we start to create a movement map and a regenerative map of all the communities and projects and everything like that, we can also start to have a really important part of the conversation, which is just as important as the voices that are here tonight, we can start looking around and saying, what voices aren't here? Just as important as who's here is who's not. And so how are we doing the work to get them in this room? And once those voices get into this room, we can actually start to have these conversations. And when we start to have those conversations and we start figuring out how to make choices and decisions to weave these tapestries and landscapes together to have these conversations, then we're actually talking about governance, and watershed governance. And we are starting to earn that sovereignty that our communities need. And also figuring out how to actually get people and the projects on the front lines who are oftentimes too busy to actually get them the support they need. How do we get them resourced so that they can do the work that we need for our region and our planet? If you like what you do, think about donating. Joe and Penny are selling books over here. And if you buy one, I bet this my gentleman might sign them.
And it'll help pay for our gas.
It's sure he likes to write the nice things in them. But I don't think he writes too many mean things. So.
Only 3.
But you can also donate, but also help yourself to the Cascadia Expo. You have things to just help yourself to them. You can always go to our website, regeneratecascadia.org, make a donation, and do whatever. And then I just like to leave off with 40 years ago, the Cascadia movement was born. And I would just like to say, okay, I'm going to pause this real quick. I wanted to say that as you've been traveling to these different communities, I think one of the most amazing parts of this experience has been the people who have been coming out and connecting, who have been doing this work for decades. One of us is in this room who probably, I think, was at the first North American Bioregional Congress in 1984. There are other people in Seattle, maybe Lance, who helped write this very, proceedings document. He was at our meeting in Seattle. And one of the coolest things is that, so if you're not familiar, this idea of Cascadia goes way back. The big thing is that it was born in 1986 at the first ever Cascadia Bioregional Congress at Evergreen University. And it was a gathering of more than 150 people who came together to ask themselves, what would it look like if we started to take responsibility for our home, for our rivers, for our watersheds, for our bioregion? And now, roughly 40 years later, we're just standing here and asking you the same question. What would it look like if we stepped up and took responsibility for our home, for our watersheds, for our bioregion? So that's the question we'd like to ask you and challenge you with. So thank you very much. And if you're interested, there is a sign-up sheet. And then if you want to get involved, really what we're asking and hope that the next steps will be is that every local place will kind of start to gather together a core team. Think about having an in-person gathering, a potluck, a something of how you keep this energy going. And then if you're interested, we're having an online bioregional summit, November 3rd through 12th. The first part will be community presentations. Everybody's welcome to present. During the week, we'll be having themed conversations that will turn into work groups. And then the last weekend is really focused on envisioning. And what we want to do is, because we're in these each community for such a short window, we want to really create space just so that different watershed organizers can come together and really start to envision together themselves without us in the way. So.
Yeah, just as a quick transition, Rose is here and is going to share a bit about how you all are already doing a pretty kick-ass job of doing this. And that's what's really interesting about this place. So we get the joy of going and spending a short amount of time in a lot of places, compressed into a short period of time, which is in the span of 2 weeks, we visit like 10 places. And so we're getting to see what's strong, what's powerful, what's unique in each place. And I gotta say, some of the weaving you all have been doing is pretty darn impressive. So I'm just gonna pass it over to Rose.
So what a great presentation, right? Like, these guys are doing like amazing work that's really, like empowering all of us to kind of look at our own communities and see the amazing qualities of what's here. And like you said, like the West Coast, Cascadia in itself is incredibly rich. I want to be mindful that we originally said that this event was over at 8. It is after 8. For people who need to leave, please feel free.
You won't hurt our feelings.
And if you want to get up and just take a break for a minute, if you want to stay longer, these guys are really good at like helping cultivate conversation in the room and stuff too. We have the room until 9. Like, we have to leave at 9 or before 9. But we're welcome to stay longer. But if people would like to get a cup of tea or something, I was just going to, just like what I had mentioned about this sheet of paper that keeps blowing around the floor. Really, the work that we did, and it was a whole bunch of us who compiled this incredible list, which is not at all everybody that's here in Jefferson County. This is just some of the people who run on volunteerism. There's so many other like great other nonprofit and for-profit, like people who are trying to create good community. And so I love that map that you had of seeing who was in whatever watershed and the different resources that were there. And we have like a plethora, as you all know. The other thing that I love about what these guys are doing is, how does that connect us? Like, here is a Bellingham representative right here, that Dave is one of the hosts of this in Bellingham in a week. And so it's like, it connects us with these other places of how we can help fulfill some of that. So if anybody wants to go, again, feel free. we were thinking of, there's a short little video there where, so this connectivity fair, or is anybody in the room at the connectivity fair? So a few people, maybe you heard about the connectivity fair. We put on this event that I'm going to show you a short video that I and a small handful of other filmmakers took some imagery of this event. There were hundreds of people there. It took place last April, and it was an event that its time had come. People were thirsty to connect, as we all have been. I mean, we are anyway, but because of COVID and how much it brought us inward, it was a really timely thing to do, and we did it. We met around, I'm a filmmaker, and one of the films that I created, we actually brought people together around that because it's a film about how what you do makes a difference. And then we had a gym full of 80 different tables of nonprofit organizations where people went around and saw places that they didn't know what kind of services they offered, or it's like I always wanted to, help marine life or help with housing. And I continue to hear great reports of how it's doing people. So you could watch this little 7-minute video that each champion helps edit, and then we're going to sense it, and then we just kind of that over and then go to discussion if you want to.
It's time for us to reconnect. It's time for us to figure out how do we do this safely, recognizing our interconnections. So that was the genesis of this idea for the connectivity fair. Almost everybody said, what a good idea. We really need this connectivity fair. So we decided we were going to do it. But if there was something you could do to help change society, the world, your community, in some way, what would that be? The film that you're about to see is about the ripple effects of our actions in an interconnected world. And when you put that formula together, you realize that what you do makes a difference.
How many times have you wondered, does my one life make a difference in the world? Do I have the potential to accomplish great things? Come with us on this journey, exploring interconnections through science and across cultures and time, noticing how your life impacts people, places, and events around the world, whether or not you're there to see the results. Nothing exists in isolation. Your smallest act can have a ripple effect far beyond what you can imagine. We are a part of something much greater than ourselves. Welcome to the Connectivity Project.
We're going to do a little turn and talk, where you turn to your neighbor, might be somebody you don't even know. I'd like to invite you to consider this question of what will you do with your opportunities? It would be lovely for you to share that and maybe even think about where you are with all of these organizations who do amazing things.
The person sitting next to me who I didn't know at all, he's not even from the community here. He wants to do something like this in his community. So he just like happened upon it. And so we did our little share, and I shared what I wanted to do. And he's like, oh, you should be this person. I was like, well, I knew that person. Now I know they want to do what I want to do. And he had his share about carbon sequestration. And I was like, oh, my dad is all about that in Vermont. I should get you guys somehow together.
What we need to remember now is we're a very connected community, and that's what today is about. All of the nonprofits represented, there's 80 of them there. Nonprofits bring out our generosity, they bring out our sense of service, they give us a sense of meaning and purpose. That is part of what's so special about living here. But that's what we're here to remember.
To be a conversation amongst the housing organizations that are represented there. One thing that I think all of us need to remember as we're sitting here in this circle talking about all these different components of housing is that there is a housing continuum, and every type and kind of housing is important to maybe meeting that question of how much is enough.
Really aware of the power of ripple effects of what our actions can create and that we actually can affect change. I know that I'm not saying anything new, but I feel like it's a blessing to be part of a community like this where that is really evident. We're ready for this now.
So you're going to ask to consider how you can help an event like this happen in other places where you know people that might be interested in having one. We want to make it go viral.
Inspiring, isn't it? And is that, I mean, it's just what these guys have been talking about and such too. And again, we are such a responsive, dialed-in community that has already done a little something of this nature because we are so rich and connected. And just like what we were saying at the end, we want to be able to help other communities do something like this. We have all the materials that we cultivated in order to like write letters of outreach and do, connecting organizations. We would love to help other communities create something like this and would love to just free source some of these things to happen. So if you know of people in other communities, be in touch with us. One of the with him, and it's because of Rick that we're here. So thank you, Rick, very much. And I get to work with him on like hosting things like this and other, like, you know, I mentioned. And so when we heard about these guys coming through Port Townsend, and they're like, we want to come to Port Townsend, can we come meet with you guys? It's like, oh wow, this would be like one obvious node network of how do we communicate with people to help offer to them the, you know, inspiration for connectivity fairs. So some of that conversation is active and ripe and going, and even the summit that Brandon was just talking about, maybe we'll do a little presentation about that to make it accessible. And then there is a conversation starting that maybe we will create another connectivity fair this year. We're unsure. It takes a lot of effort to do that and a lot of people. So we're catching names of people who might want to, you know, help with parts of it. But just an interesting, real big example of, you know, our little region to a larger bioregion. So it fits so well with what these guys have been sharing with us. So thanks for those of you who come and that come again. And also just, I imagine everybody in here is involved in some kind of service to a better world.
So yeah, thank you everyone for coming tonight and for your attention. And I want to just name a couple of things really quickly about how this is not meant to be just a one-stop, like we come and talk and then we leave. Is it actually a big part of the Regenerate Cascadia website that Brandon has been working with the team to build is to create coordination tools for organizing in multiple landscapes at the same time. And one of the things that they're hosting as a capstone to this 30-day wild rock band tour that we're on is that there's going to be a bioregional summit from November 3rd through 12th. It'll be an online summit to really gather some of the energy and conversations in the different communities. But another thing that's happening, and like we had this great conversation earlier today about what it would mean to actually organize bioregional learning processes in a bioregional learning center right here. And while we were on Whidbey Island, we were talking with people at the Whidbey Institute about very similar things. And while we were down in Portland, Oregon, we were talking with people about creating a gap year program for young people, where it's a gap year in quotes. Because what if they never go to college? What if they just join the regenerative movement and go work on regenerative farms and live in eco-villages and all the other? And we're talking about creating pathways for connectivity across the bioregion. And so what we want to invite in this conversation is a beginning to a new conversation that builds on a conversation that came before. And one of the reasons for this that's so important is that you all need to organize your own bioregion. And another reason is that you have the privilege of living in the most mature, most complex, and most advanced bioregional movement on Earth. Which means what you do here will be noticed by people in other places, because, I don't know if you know this, but the bioregional movement's actually taking off again. So I work a lot in the regenerative movement, which is like the same thing, actually. It's like what we're figuring out is that there are people all over the world now trying to create regenerative economies and landscape regeneration. And increasingly, they're learning about bioregionalism. And bioregions as a way of organizing is spreading all over the world. And as people go online and go, bioregions, where are they? And Cascadia just, it's known, it's documented, it has a long history. Which means if there is a Regenerate Cascadia movement, and imagine if you create a Cascadia Regeneration Fund, imagine we get a large amount of resources in it, and we mobilize it across watersheds, and we start telling the story of the Elwha Dam removal. And one thing we learned earlier this trip was there was the White Salmon Dam removal down in the Columbia River Gorge, which we didn't even know about. That was like super cool. And there are other stories. There's so many stories to tell. And so the invitation is really live well as a member of your place, or as Peter Berg, one of the great bioregional promoters, would say, to become an inhabitant of your place rather than a resident. To inhabit, to live in your habitat. He was a beat poet and a theater guy, so he loved those words. To really inhabit your place, but then also to really learn and exchange with other places. And so there's huge need and opportunity for this work for the reasons that I talked about at the dark and somber part of my presentation. And so I want to really invite this conversation to actually be a conversation instead of just us talking at you, which means for you all to be talking with each other. And so what I'd love to invite is anyone who would like to talk amongst yourselves now about how you might like to organize, or how you already are organizing, and how you can organize with the people in Eugene, with the people in Portland, with the people we're about to go see in Victoria, with the people we're about to see in Bellingham, and in other places along this tour. And by the way, we're already talking about another one for other parts of the bioregion, because damn, this is a big bioregion. And so the idea is to really create a sustained forward motion. And so if you're interested in getting involved, come to the Bioregional Summit. You can sign up at regeneratecascadia.org or talk to Brandon. He'll give you more info. Come and chat with us, the organizers and the participants of this event. And more importantly, talk to each other about what you're going to do when we pass on, because Penny and I are going back to Colombia. So clearly, we're not the ones building the bioregional effort here. We're doing it in the Northern Andes. And we need you, just like other places do. And so this is really the invitation, is humanity can rally into bioregional frameworks, or humanity can unravel into broken tatters of fallen civilization. By the way, newsflash, the civilization is going down no matter what. All civilizations collapse. That's what they do. All 300 known civilizations have collapsed. It's what's born after. So what are we building for that comes after? My estimation is that regeneration of Cascadia is a 200 to 500 year project that leads to 10,000-year-old old-growth forests, like the few remaining ones that still exist. Meaning you get this maturity across thousands of years in these ecosystems. They're frickin' incredible. And so we're talking about hundreds of years. This is work that goes beyond any of our lifetimes in this room. And so that's the invitation, is for this to become a conversation that grows into real governing capacity for what we need to do for the future. So I want to invite, rather than having like a formal facilitation, I want to actually invite just small conversations with your neighbors, and we'll be sort of floating around and hanging out if you want to talk to us specifically. And that's because we got about a half an hour till we need to clear the room. So I think if we just sort of break apart as a whole group, have any conversations that just can, ruminate a little bit. By the way, ruminate's what cows do when they're chewing their cud. Just like chew on it a little bit. And then see where it goes. And come and talk to us about getting involved, including, more importantly, probably talking to Rick and Rose and Christy and about the organizing of what comes after this. So that's it. Thank you very much. And we look forward to working together in the future.